friends from other universities here. You're very welcome. Thank you for coming. The Pro-Chancellor of Liverpool is here, and members of council, and some other universities I recognize you. You're very welcome. This is an interesting session because one of our Hope scholars, who was a prolific writer in the area of educational policy, has produced this latest book. There's no gainsaying that what we're seeing in Britain, or British higher education, certainly English higher education, is probably the most radical change we've had ever in the history of this country, and certainly unparalleled in any of the countries I worked in, and that's on 4 continents. Just no other country in the world has chosen to go down this route. Now, what amazes me, Roger, is the fact that it was done without any legislation. It was done without any mandate in any election. In fact, in the elections, all the parties said that the Brown Review was going to give us the answers, and when the answers came, it would have gone in the best of the British tradition as a green paper, and then a white paper, and then legislation. But what we had, or have at the moment, is a radical restructuring of funding in this country, England especially. Thank God the Scots still take their own line, without any legislation. And so we have the marketisation of higher education, under which all of us, no matter which university we're in, will have to learn to live with. I'm afraid it's a fait accompli. It's implemented, and this year, this academic year, was the first year we're having to live under an entirely new regime. I've just come back from the USA, where while our government thinks about us wanting us to be more and more like the Americans, one forgets that 72% of all American education is still state funded. 72%. And that the other 28% have a long, long tradition, several hundred years tradition, of philanthropy, so that even without government funding, you have large enough endowments, Harvard being the biggest, of course, with 32 billion as an endowment, the interest of which can easily run the university over and above fees. We have a fees regime, and every citizen who borrows to come to university becomes a borrower from the state. It's quite an unusual model, and so we need to understand it. And we need people like Professor Brown to actually give us the detail, and that's what we get from this new book, which I have my copy already, thankfully, and it makes fascinating reading, and I do recommend the book to anyone in university education in this country to read, because it has lots and lots of hard data. The other thing that bothers me, ladies and gentlemen, is by and large we sleepwalked into the situation, with the vice-chancellors and a few others saying very, very little about the changes. We just acquiesced and we live under it. It's quite an amazing situation we're in. The students protested about higher fees, but this is not just about higher fees, it's about a fundamental change to the British higher education system. There have been so few voices against this, and I'm delighted that one of our professors, Professor Roger Brown, the former Vice-Chancellor of a British University in the South, Southampton, Solent, that he has been among the very, very few voices who has the courage to stand up and say things as they are. Doesn't make him loved by everybody, certainly not by Caesar's household, but he's certainly is a brave voice in difficult times when the bulk of us acquiesced and accepted it. So it's a great joy that you are here to listen to this lecture. And Roger, thank you for being willing to give it. But I'm going to ask Dr. Tony Edwards, please, to introduce our speaker. Dr. Edwards.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Tony Edwards. I'm the head of the School of Educational Studies inside the Faculty of Education. And I'm here today acting on behalf of Professor Bart McGettrick, who can't be here. And I'm sure he'd have some very pithy and very sort of interesting and amusing things to say. And I'm not going to attempt to replicate his style. I'm going to do it in my own style. You'll also be pleased to know that I'm only going to speak for a very short period of time, because Roger is the kind of main issue here today. But as Professor Pillay said, Roger actually works with us at the moment as the co-director of the Institute for the Centre for Higher Education. And sometimes when you have somebody that you work with, you forget the other things that somebody has done. So as part of the introduction to Roger's sort of seminar about the marketisation of higher education, I just want to talk about some of the things that he's currently doing and some of the things that he has done. He was, or is currently, the co-director for the Centre for Higher Education here at Hope. He's also currently visiting professor at the University of East London, at Napier University in Edinburgh, and the University of Southampton. He's also honorary visiting fellow at the London Metropolitan University and the Oxford Centre for Higher Education Studies. Formerly, he was, as Professor Pillay said, Vice-Chancellor at Southampton Solent University and also Chief Executive of the Higher Education Quality Council. Unusually, he's also worked in the civil service, the Cabinet Office and local education. And that's a fantastic kind of range of things that people have been involved in. And I think it probably gives him almost a unique insight onto the connection between politics and education. And I have no doubt that at some point in his time he's come across a Sir Humphrey or a number of Sir Humphreys from Yes Minister fame and has had to deal with those. Roger's lectured extensively and written widely on higher education, and rather topically, his most recent contribution has been on the impact of Margaret Thatcher on higher education in the Times Higher Education on April the 8th. He says on his CV that his leisure interests include music of many different forms and also sports and food and wine. But I'm really puzzled to think about how does a person who has so many activities, either past or present, find the time to do anything other than simply think about his work. Nevertheless, he's brought his considerable expertise to bear on the vexed question of the changes in higher education in the UK, and he's going to talk to us now about that and the things that underpin his most recent book, Everything for Sale, the Marketisation of Higher Education. And with that, that's my bit finished, and I'd like to welcome Roger and forward you.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you very much. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Tony, and thank you also to Professor Pillay for those very kind remarks. The answer to your last question, by the way, is with difficulty. Okay, and thank you particularly to those who have come today, and I will talk for about half an hour, if I may, and then I would very much like to respond to questions. And in particular, I always say, please tell me what I've got wrong, because these are quite complex matters and there's more than one perspective on them. In fact, today I do want to do, well, three things really, very quickly. First of all, I just want to say what the book is about, in case it should interest you in acquiring it or reading it. Secondly, I want to comment a bit on the current government's reforms, going beyond really what I said in the book. But then thirdly, I also want to go a bit beyond the book in talking about what I think are some of the lessons from the policies that the government has been applying. If you've ever written a book or anything of that kind, you know that you always end with a sort of feeling of frustration, even of failure, because there were things that you only realised after you sent off the proofs that you should have included or commented upon. And so I'm afraid you're a little bit of a guinea pig here this afternoon, because you will hear some things that are in the book, but you'll also hear some things that are not. And I hope that helps to retain some of the freshness to what are, I'm afraid, in some respects, quite depressing kinds of issues. Let me start then with the book. I was in the States in 2010 on a sort of tour of American centres for higher education, representing, obviously, Liverpool Hope. And it was at about the time when the Brown Committee was finalising its deliberations, as the Vice-Chancellor mentioned. And some American friends of mine began contacting me and saying, is it really true that the UK is going to abolish the limit on fees? Is it really true they're going to abolish place controls on place? No, no, not at all. Absolutely, completely unheard of. No one would ever do anything silly like that. When I got back, I found that was exactly what they were planning to do. And that was what stimulated me to write the book, because I thought, well, someone, particularly someone like myself who's been involved in a lot of this, really ought, before it's too late, just to sort of explain kind of how we got to the point now, because I suppose you'd expect me to say as a historian that I'd always want to see what had happened in the past, and of course the past is never a guide to what happens to the future, but it is always a good sort of starting point. So the motive for the book then was to try to understand how we'd got to the point of these reforms, and I'll speak about the reforms in a minute. What I discovered, going back through the period that I've been involved in higher education policy making since the mid-80s, that in fact there have been a whole series of policy decisions since 1980, since 1979, which had taken us in the direction that we are now in, and which the Vice-Chancellor indicated. And it began with the decision to charge full cost fees to overseas students. It's unbelievable now, but in the 70s and before, overseas students didn't pay the full cost fee. They simply paid a fee that was subsidised by the state. And one of the first things that the Thatcher government did in October 79 was to say that in future all overseas students should charge a full cost fee. Now, again a contrast, Professor Pillay, with what happened recently with our fees. There was a tremendous amount of controversy over it. Committees were set up, there were marches in Parliament and all the rest of it for overseas students, but the government stuck to its guns. Then, of course, we had the 1981 funding cuts, the university's response to which showed that they, in fact, were like any other organisation at the end of the day. They would do almost anything, even at that stage, to balance their books. More significantly for my story was the introduction of research selectivity in 1986, the result of which, as you know, is a very high degree of concentration of research resources. We then had the increase in the student fee in 1989, the introduction of loans, maintenance loans for students in 1990, abolition of the binary line in 1992, which immediately extended the number of universities. We had, of course, top-up fees in 1998, variable fees in 2006, and now from 2012 we have a voucher system for funding student education. So there's a clear historical evolution there in the market direction. What the book then does is to analyse these in considerable detail under four headings. The first being changes in the structure of the system, such as the increase in the number of universities, the reduction of formal limits on institutional development, etc., and then right at the end of the period, the encouragement for for-profit providers. Secondly, it looks at the funding of student education, both teaching and student support, again covering that period. Thirdly, it looks at the funding of research and the effects of research concentration and selectivity. And finally, as you would expect from me, there's a chapter on quality assurance and the gradual growth of a consumer-driven quality system. I also mention en passant the corporatisation of university governance, the attempt to make university governing bodies more like the boards of PLCs, and I also mention the development of sector-wide institutional performance indicators, but I don't deal with them in detail in the book. And I also note that there are other markets in which higher education institutions are operating, such as, for example, the market for academic staff, donations, which Professor Pillay mentioned, capital, and various other things. So I've tried to cover in the book the way in which all these policies were developed, and I'll say a bit about the impact in a minute. Then, of course, as I was sort of writing the book, the government was announcing and then changing fairly rapidly its various kind of policies. And so we've had, as Professor Pillay has said, the reduction in direct state funding for teaching, so that now an institution like Liverpool Hope will be getting from 2015-16 all of its funding for teaching in the form of fees, very little direct kind of subsidies. And as I was saying, I think to someone before the lecture started, I cannot understand why people didn't understand that this was a really dramatic development. At the time, all the issue was about the level of the fee, whether the fee would be increased, what it would be, the terms of repayment, whether they were more or less fair than before. those are all second-order issues, to be frank with you. The really crucial issue is the introduction of a voucher system, which was first put forward by Milton Friedman in 1962. He never thought anybody would take it seriously, and lo and behold, we have a voucher system for funding higher education. And this is indeed, as Professor Pillay has said, not only the most radical change in this higher education system, but in any other. And if you look at the little pamphlet on vouchers, 2009, Bicradner and Thompson, they are virtually untried in higher education before. They haven't even been much tried in the States in schools, and yet here we are, we've got a voucher system, as it were. But of course that wasn't the only reform. We've also had the partial liberalisation of funded places with the AAB, AB++ relaxation. We've had attempts to reduce entry barriers to higher education so that suddenly we find ourselves with many more, even more, universities. And last but not least, and you'll all be experiencing this if you work in an institution or have anything to do, the improvement or the increasing consumer leverage, the way in which students are supposedly at the centre of the system. And if you're really cynical, you can see this also as part of a broader attempt to dismantle the welfare state and transfer responsibilities from the state to the individual. Now, for the avoidance of doubt, as the lawyers say, we have to recognise that what we have is still well short of what an economist would regard as a true economic market. We still have a fee cap, brackets how much longer. We still have most student places subject to overall controls. We do still have less competition on fees than I think the government hoped for or expected. There are some subsidies for special subjects and one or two other things. There do remain barriers to entry, although they may be changed, and we do have regulation continuing, and indeed, ironically, probably enhancing as a result of market competition. However, if you stand back from that and look at how far the system's come, we do have now something which is much closer to being a market, and in particular, I think, the threat of entry from for-profit providers, companies like Pearson's, which certainly would have happened if the government had got legislation into Parliament. And it's interesting, Professor Pillay, that they backed off because of the privatisation scare that they felt after the NHS legislation, but that may come. And even if we don't have a proper higher education market, we sure as anything have market-like behaviour on the part of institutions, students, and others associated with higher education. And as Professor Pillay said, it is depressing and regrettable that so few people in positions of authority, particularly vice-chancellors, spoke out about the longer-term kind of issues, which is what I want to now come on to, which is the whole question of the impact of these developments on higher education, and then going on from that, what can be the impact in future. Now, again, for the avoidance of doubt, I want to make it clear that not all the impacts of increased market competition have been negative. I think it is undeniable that British universities are more efficient now than they were even 10 years ago, and more efficient than the universities of nearly every other major system. And that is not surprising in view of the policies, but it's still worth saying. It's also, I think, undeniable, though there may be evidence to confute this, that again, in comparison with universities in most other systems, British universities are increasingly responsive to students, student services, student interest, which is not to say they couldn't be more, but I'm looking at it in a comparative kind of frame. It's probably also the case that British universities are more innovative than universities in many other systems, particularly continental Europe, although, as I'll explain in a minute, that's a slightly double-edged sword. And finally, I think it's indisputable that the application of policies of competition, which, as I've said, go back some way, have made the resources for higher education go further, and therefore the claims on the taxpayer and the student are less. But I also point out in my book that to some extent these competitive policies were actually a diversion, an attempt to lead people away from the realization that actually we weren't investing enough in higher education in the first place, and I think that's a very, very clear picture. Nevertheless, it would be wrong to say that all these competitive pressures are negative. That's not at all the case. But there is another side to the story, What I point to in my book is the fact that these competitive pressures have stratified the sector to a greater degree than was previously the case. One simple example, Cambridge, on my reckoning, has 4 times the income per student of, I hope there isn't anyone from Edge Hill here today. If there is, I've made my peace with John Cater, so don't worry too much. But it is the case that in 2010-11, after allowing for the differences of subjects, Edge Hill had 4 times the revenue per student of Cambridge had 4 times the revenue of Edge Hill. That would indeed be the revolution when Edge Hill has 4 times the revenue of Cambridge. Cambridge, of course, has 10 times the revenue, 10 times the assets per student. But anyway, we already have stratification. It will get worse. Also, diversity has been reduced. What's happened effectively is that reputational hierarchy has replaced functional diversity. The abolition of the binary line, paradoxically, has reduced functional diversity as too many institutions decided simply to ape better established institutions. There has also been a significant reduction in collegiality and the integration of universities as entities, an increased differentiation of activities, of structures and of personnel. Even more seriously, as a result of these pressures, the academic community is losing control of the academic agenda, by which I mean what is taught and how it's taught, what is researched and how it's researched. This arises from increased privatization, commercial funding, but also arises from marketisation. And then I think most seriously of all, the more that universities have gone down the market-private path, the more they look like other commercial organisations and the less they look like universities or colleges. And that is a really serious matter, because universities, whatever you think about them, do fulfil a valued role in society. They are there to research and to disseminate knowledge for its own sake and not for any wider purpose. Now, the moment they forsake that mission and simply become money-grubbing, concerned with income, concerned with exploitation, concerned with things like branding and marketing, the game is lost, and that is the risk that we run. And what will happen, undoubtedly, is that the universities have a kind of informal compact with society. They operate, in most countries, with a high degree of autonomy and self-responsibility because they provide valued public goods such as a better educated citizenry, a more literate population, and so on. The more they look like commercial entities, the more people, including the other commercial entities with which they're competing, will say, hang on, why should universities have all these privileges? We'd like to be like them. And that's a trend that's already started in America, and I can predict that it will happen here. Finally, on this question of the impacts, there are 2 further things I should mention. One is the impact on quality. Now, again, if you had Mr. Willits here, he would bring tears to your eyes about the ways in which increased market competition improves quality in higher education. I'm afraid the evidence does not support that. Things like grade inflation, grade grubbing are not an accident. They are a direct result of increased market competition. Greater cheating, greater plagiarism, these are all things that happen more with market competition. Consumerization, the commodification of higher education, all these are phenomena that are alive, are real, and exist, and will become stronger. And the other issue, and I must mention it particularly in Liverpool Hope, is the whole issue of equity and fairness to students from different backgrounds, different minorities, and so on. And I'm afraid the broad, brutal conclusion is that on the whole, markets reproduce social inequalities rather than redress them, and that is inherent in the nature of marketisation as it stands. So that's a pretty mixed picture, and it is set out in more detail in the book, and I urge you to go to the book for the nuances, but I think that's a reasonable representation of what has happened. And in a monograph I've just about to be published by the University of California, Berkeley, I do a kind of update on the conclusions of the book, and basically what I say is that the current reforms will exacerbate these impacts, particularly stratification and reduction in diversity, and they will make it harder, are already making it harder, for institutions like Liverpool Hope to pursue their distinctive missions. One of the things which you will hear ministers say is, well, of course, market competition enables institutions to pursue their distinctive mission, etc. They occupy a particular market niche. I'm afraid, Minister, higher education markets don't work like that, and the evidence is all around us, I'm afraid. Why don't they work like that? Well, very briefly, the usual critique of markets in relation to the provision of public services like health, social welfare, housing, education, is the public goods externalities argument, the idea that there are broader benefits that it will not be in the interest of a private producer to supply. Now, that is undoubtedly the case, and as Professor Pillay knows, because he and I have discussed it on more than one occasion, the real viciousness of the post-Brown debate in UK higher education has been about the emphasis of private benefits and private goods, when equally important are the public benefits and public goods. So that is a really significant objection to market organisation of services like higher education or health. But in the case of higher education, there is another problem, which in my view is even more of a barrier to the application of market principles, and that's the question of information. It's very risky to say that all economists agree that, but I think most economists would agree that if you're going to have any kind of proper market, you do need to have information about products that enables consumers to choose between them. In higher education, and I've witnessed this struggle for more than 20 years, attempts are made to provide information for consumers to enable them to choose between different subjects, institutions, courses, modes of study, etc. These attempts will always end in failure. Professor Martin Trove, famous professor of higher education at Berkeley, said, higher education is a process masquerading as an outcome. So in other words, you can have some process measures, but they still won't tell you very much about the quality of education you're going to receive, not least because, as we're always saying, students are, of course, co-producers, contributors to their own education and to that of their fellows. So it is a pointless exercise. However, if you're going to organise yourself on market lines, inevitably there will be a request for information, and so we have now the National Student Survey, the key information set, and similar kinds of things. What happens where you don't have proper information about quality is that consumers seek substitutes. In an ordinary product market, if you can't test the televisions, you know that particular brands are more acceptable than others, have a better record than others. So in higher education, in lieu of any really reliable or useful information about educational quality, what happens is that institutional prestige and reputation become the keys. This is why it is simply idle to suppose that institutions can suddenly go from number 50 in the higher education tables to number 10. It simply doesn't work like that. It may happen over many generations, but it won't happen like that. And the league tables, based as they are on imports, simply reinforce that kind of process. There's more I could say on that, but I think it's important to understand the informational issues. By the way, I have tried to explain this to the minister, or at least his advisors, and I haven't, I'm afraid, got very far. Okay, I want to finally finish with just something about what are the lessons, really, and I want to take in particular, if I could, each of the main claims for market organisation of higher education and say how far, on the basis of my work in this book and the previous book, Higher Education and the Market, those claims can be sustained. And just to say what the claims are, first of all, that marketisation increases efficiency, secondly, that it increases quality, thirdly, that it increases innovation, fourthly, that it increases diversity, and fifthly, that it increases student choice. And I will also finally say a word about equity. Let me start with increased efficiency. As I say, the argument is that greater competition means greater efficiency. Institutions put their resources better use. This is obviously positive, particularly for the taxpayer, the funder, because it means that their resources go further or claims on them are reduced. But the biggest single irony about market competition is that what begins as an attempt to provide greater value for money for students and other funders, in the end leads to a lot of waste. You add up the costs of all the resources put into bidding for various funds, the costs of regulation, which increases as market competition increases, all the resources diverted into marketing and branding, the resources for collecting fees, and all sorts of things of that kind, they all, I'm afraid, largely offset the gains in efficiency that one had seen originally. On any international comparative view, British higher education is just the most efficient in the world. Hands up those who know that our student-staff ratios in the universities are now well above those in our state secondary schools and twice those in our public private schools. So we've gone beyond the efficiency argument, I think. The second argument is the one about quality. If Mr. Willits were here, he would try to persuade you that giving more information to students, making students more central, will increase quality. The reality is that that is not a secure way to improve quality. In particular, what marketisation does is to take the decisions about quality, the appropriateness of standards, out of the hands of the academic community, who should be and are the professional guardians of academic standards, and puts them into the hands of, not students, actually the media. The league tables, websites like ratemyprofessor.com, the National Student Survey, now the KISS, these are all devices of that kind, and they will shift responsibility for standards away from the academic community. And it's a particular weakness of our regulatory system that it allows that to happen. Increased innovation. Now, as I've said, there is an argument, market advocates, that innovation, as well as increasing efficiency and quality, forces institutions to innovate more. You'll be familiar with the argument, in order to obtain market share, profits, or whatever, companies need to innovate, ditto institutions. All I can say is that the innovative record is pretty mixed. What happens you have to understand that markets in higher education are not an economic market. Institutions are not competing really on economic factors. What they're competing on is reputation, status, prestige. And what happens, therefore, is that the multi-faculty, research-intensive, large university becomes the model which other institutions ape to follow, and, of course, the league tables then reinforce that kind of process. So, in fact, my book argues that there has been a significant reduction in institutional diversity as these forces have come forward. And as I say, the argument about niche is simply false. It doesn't work like that. What happens is that the dominant institutions are set the pattern in the sector, and everybody who studies there, they go and maybe study at Oxford and Cambridge or similar institutions, and they spend many of them the rest of their careers either wishing they were back at Oxford and Cambridge, or trying to make their places like Oxford and Cambridge, or etc., etc. So I'm afraid I don't buy the diversity argument. I think to get diversity, you probably have to have more state intervention. And the final irony of marketisation concerns student choice. Again, if Mr. Willits were here, he would, I'm sure, be very silver-tongued in persuading you that these measures are necessary to increase student choice. Well, again, a great irony here. Actually, will reduce student choice, because what we will see, are already seeing, is a rationalisation of subjects on offer. A rationalisation of institutions will follow. We will end up with fewer centres offering particular courses as a result of that. And the reason for that is because if you go back to a mixed funding system for teaching, HEFCE can effectively subsidise institutions to offer the subjects they wish to offer, and institutions can cross-subsidise between subjects. Once you have transparency, once you know what the fee income is going to be used for, it will be much harder to justify, for instance, using teaching funding to subsidise research, or vice versa. It'll be much harder to justify subsidising, let's say, archaeology from the proceeds from offering business studies. Now, cross-subsidy is the key to an effective higher education system. It's under threat in America, and it's now going to be under threat in the UK. Institutions are going to be looking very, very hard at their portfolios, particularly institutions like Hope that don't yet have a plurality or diversity of funding sources are going to find it very, very hard over the years to continue to offer a wide range of subjects. So, ironically, that will happen, that student choice will reduce. And we've already seen that in physics and chemistry, where the number of centres is considerably reduced even without the increased fees. So, in other words, each of the arguments for markets can be sustained up to a point, but when pushed too far, they turn again, and it then becomes kind of ironic. Finally, the question of equity, which is very, very absent, I'm afraid, from most government considerations. I don't think even Mr. Willits would seriously argue that marketisation improves equity. My argument is that it will exacerbate inequalities between different groups rather than increase it. And that happens in three ways. First of all, because of the emphasis upon the economic aspects of higher education, many students from less favourable backgrounds or backgrounds less familiar with higher education will think, is it worth the increased cost? Well, is it worth the increased debt? Secondly, the government's argument is that if you have a market, the more popular, prestigious institutions will expand. But of course they don't, because if they do too much, that then affects their ability of prestige. And the third argument, of course, is the one about stratification. The more you stratify the system, you also stratify the institution, the subject groups from which students are taken. So in Britain and in America, the most selective institutions mainly recruit from people from public schools and better established state schools from established middle class backgrounds, and other universities, including universities like Liverpool Hope, fulfill the social function of recruiting students from state schools and less favoured social backgrounds. And that, again, is an inevitable consequence of marketisation. And I would add, subject of another book, that of course we're not just talking about marketisation in higher education, we're also talking about the application of market principles to the schools as well. And so marketisation in higher education then reinforces marketisation in the schools and vice versa. So what conclusions do I draw from this story? 5 final points. First of all, you should always be sceptical as good academic scholars about the claims made either for or against a particular proposition. All claims about marketisation, benefits or detriments should be qualified and subject to proper inspection and inquiry. Secondly, I may have laboured too much, but I haven't seen it referred to as much as I would have expected. This crucial question of information. If it is possible for students to know in advance where the best place for them to study is, then that's fine. But if it isn't possible to do that, maybe we shouldn't try to ask them to make those decisions in the first place. And I think there is a moral issue about putting so much weight upon student decisions at the ages of 16, 17 or 18 with so little information. Third conclusion, market organisation may have some benefits in easing the overall funding pressures, but it isn't a panacea for adequate funding. Systems can be underfunded for surprisingly long periods, but at some point reality will catch up with them. We still have a big investment backlog in UK higher education, primarily about investment in buildings and plant, but also an investment in staff. Fourthly, and the crucial role of the government, at the end of the day, the only way of protecting the public benefits and public goods of higher education is through state action. And governments need to recognise that and be prepared to intervene and to commit resources in order to do that. And they need to take a view at any one time about the balance of competition, quasi-competition and things. And finally, and again for the avoidance of doubt, if you think that increased competition means less regulation, then have another thought to it. Because just because of the limitations of the ability to apply market theory to higher education, that inevitably the consequences of that is that governments will inevitably intervene in various ways to a much greater extent. There is no secure basis for thinking that increased market competition means less regulation. It actually simply means more ineffectual regulation rather than more effective self-regulation. I'm sorry to end on a rather pessimistic note, but as a famous philosopher, not Plato, I think, Vice-Chancellor, said, the beginning of wisdom is a grasp of the obvious. And I'm sorry if, when you read my book, you'll feel that I've rather laboured the obvious, but someone's got to do it, and it might as well be me. The programme does say, but I'll mention it now, that there are copies of the book available for purchase afterwards. They're offered at something pretty close to the author's preferred price of £20. I'll be delighted if people want to buy the book, but I'll be even more delighted if people read it, and still more delighted if they go away and write to their Member of Parliament to protest at what the government is doing. Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, it's a good question, and a very timely one. I mean, the short answer is that universities could stop behaving like private companies and start behaving like, public providers. Beyond that, I think what the university should do, both nationally and in their local communities, is to point to the very many public benefits that universities provide. I mean, these are almost taken for granted now. The universities, for example, have a concert hall, or they are involved in economic regeneration, or they sponsor academies and things of that kind. And there isn't sufficient public awareness of that. And I think the Vice-Chancellors and the Vice-Chancellors' organisation has a particular role to play, because no one else will do it. The government won't do it. The government doesn't believe in it. So there need to be reminders. The other thing is that there is beginning to be an attempt made now to actually quantify the public benefits of higher education. And an American professor with whom I've been in touch, called Walter McMahon, who's based at University of Chicago, he has actually produced quite a convincing account of the monetary value of the public benefits of higher education. And really what we ought to be doing is all writing to our MPs, drawing attention to this, because the sad thing is that if you the more you privatise something, the more people are unwilling to pay for the public benefits that remain. And if we're not careful, we shall lose those public benefits.
Thanks very much for that, Roger. One question I've got at the top of my mind is, if students are now framed as consumers by the government, do you think that students already are beginning to view themselves as consumers, and as a result they view themselves as buying their degree, as opposed to working for it? Yes, they work for it, but also they buy it.
Yes, I mean, the first question is that we don't really know, because one of the sad aspects of all this, and one of the reasons why I wrote the book, was because I didn't think we knew enough about these kind of phenomena to be able to say the answer to questions of that kind. I'm not sure we still do. There are two answers in different directions. First of all, I think every institution is finding an increase in things like student complaints, and are finding more students questioning, for example, the marks that they're given and that sort of thing. And this began a long time ago in the States. In 1994, when I was running the Quality Council, a number of us went to the northeast United States to see how the Americans did quality. And there was quite a lot going on at that time in New York about affirmative action for ethnic minorities. And we talked about the academic consequences of this with a group of academic staff at the State University of New York. And one of them said, we were talking about the way in which particular people queried the marks they were given. One quite senior professor said, yes, it's as bad as the days of the Vietnam War. And I didn't know what he meant, so the moment we broke for coffee, I went round and said, I'm sorry, I didn't understand the reference. Well, he said, I was a junior lecturer in the days of the Vietnam War, and you knew that the grade you gave the student would determine whether they avoided the draft or not. And he said, it's a similar issue now. If you know that the student comes from a particular background, you're going to look very carefully about the mark that you're giving them. So I think there is that general sort of tendency. Having said that, if you look at some other work, for example, I commend something called the Future Track Survey, where they've looked at what students say they're involved in higher education with. I think the majority of students still reject the idea, insofar as they conceptualize it, probably reject the notion that they're simply a consumer. And they are still in higher education, many of them, for the purposes, for which we would have gone into higher education, in other words, general enlightenment and intellectual development. But a chilling piece of information, I'm sure everybody here will know about the Key Information Set, which purports to provide quality information for every individual undergraduate course. The Minister, Willits, is working very hard with some economists. He would like that to show the typical earnings of a typical graduate from each of those courses over a lifetime, and he's pushing the student loans company to show how much debt is associated with a typical student on that course over the course of their careers, the RAB charge, in other words. Now, if you can think of a purer view of the reduction of the higher education to an economic entity than this kind of information, I can't think of anything more. And that is what it's really about. And I think it's the end of higher education, really, if those are going to be the criteria. And a further point, you can't blame students for behaving in a rational, calculative, consumer kind of way, because institutions are doing it as well. You know, the information provided by institutions to the league tables, for example, the ways in which returns are made to agencies, many other things that I'd better not mention in polite company, are examples of institutions themselves cheating. So if we're cheating, how can we blame the students for cheating? And I'm afraid there is a growing tendency in that direction.
Just wondering really about the future. Do you see this as one track forward, no way back? I mean, is there any appetite, do you feel, amongst other political parties, for example, to change the direction of higher education?
Well, not on the basis of my contacts, anyway. I mean, the present Labour shadow minister, Shabana Mahmood, who is basically in my view, a very bright woman, is saying the right kind of things. But of course, what people say in opposition and what they do in government are quite different, as we found with the Liberal Democrats and their opposition to fees, etc. So I don't see any real. I see people when I talk to people, they recognise the point I'm making, but I can't get any indication at all as to whether actually, if they were in government, they would actually change things, and I suspect that they won't, because the fact is that the higher education has got this big problem, unlike many other areas of public expenditure, that it can, after a fashion, generate private revenue. I mean, this is what has done for the American state universities. The expenditure each year on prisons, hospitals, security in many American states means that higher education has lost out. And I think, to some extent, the same is happening here. Going back to the question over here, higher education doesn't have a national lobby in the way that obviously the health service does. Universities don't inspire affection, unfortunately. And therefore I can't see where the political pressures are going to come on politicians. And of course the other thing is, higher education is by definition a long-term exercise, a long-term investment. You can't see the benefits immediately, and I think by the time people realise the damage that's been done, it'll be too late to change it. Sorry to give you a rather pessimistic answer.
My question was similar, really, but given that it was the Labour government that commissioned the Brown Review, I think that's right, wasn't it? Is the implementation of the review inevitable, or would there be an alternative sort of way of implementing it? It's probably the same question.
Well, no, I mean, it isn't. I mean, basically, it is true, John, that a Labour government did commission it, but it was done with all-party support. As happened with the Deering Committee back in the mid-90s, the politicians were desperate that higher education shouldn't be an issue in the election, and so they effectively parked it with Lord Brown until after the election, as it were. I don't think a Labour government would have gone as far as the present government has gone in increasing the fee or doing some of the other things that have happened, but you know, that they're only talking about reducing the fee. They're not talking about abolishing fees altogether. They would be a bit more cautious about private providers. They might be less inclined to deregulate places, but they are just as much subject to lobbying by the leading institutions as anyone else. I mean, part of the problem here is that these issues are partly generated by higher education. Vince Cable, the Secretary of State, in 2010, soon after the Brown Review was published, gave a speech to the Girls' Schools Association in Manchester. I don't know what they thought about this, because I'm sure they weren't expecting to hear this, but basically he said, we've done this, i.e. increased the fee cap, because we've been lobbied by places like Oxford, Cambridge, London School of Economics, etc., who want to put up the fees so they can compete with the American institutions. So, you know, within the overall economic framework, there was an element of lobbying there. And, you know, had Oxford and Cambridge and LSE all said, no, we're all completely against putting up the fee, you know, etc., they would, but they wouldn't. And I'm afraid this is a common feature of both Labour and Conservative ministers I've worked with over many years, they take far more attention to what Oxford and Cambridge, for example, say than they would ever say take notice of an institution like Liverpool Hope, even though what you really need is a world-class system, not world-class universities.
Thanks very much. I was really interested in what you were saying just at the end there about Oxford and Cambridge and the big research colleges in London. And it seems, I wonder whether you mentioned earlier that there's a need for long-term investment, higher education as a long-term investment. I wonder whether government is up to that role as well. I mean, it seems that in the past sort of 20, 40 years perhaps, the world has seen the emergence of these kind of super universities, the likes of the big four colleges in London, Oxbridge, the Ivy League. And of course they are all based around centres of global capital, around London, New York City, Switzerland. Some of the oil states are now trying to build these. And the countries that are kind of unencumbered by these super universities seem to be much happier to invest in higher education as a public good, like France, like Scotland. I wonder whether there's a need to say, well, those institutions are doing these incredibly long-term abstract things, and we need to kind of set those free to ride the market tide and just have focused the state investment on the kinds of universities that are needed for a world-class system, as you say.
That is a very seductive and very, very dangerous argument. It's seductive because cutting the elite free immediately, as you say, in principle means that state resources can be channeled to the rest. Well, first of all, that wouldn't be the case because these universities would not be able to support their research from private funds, so they'd still need to have access to public funds for research. There's no way that our British companies, loath as they always are to put their hands in their pockets for anything, except, I'm sorry to say, handouts themselves in many cases, would actually step into the breach in the research council. So that's not a starter. But on top of that, what the case of America shows is that you cannot actually afford to have a large private sector of higher education. Because what happens, going back to my argument about information, is that these very prestigious universities, without any limits on what they can charge, simply charge what the market will bear. Therefore, you have in America 100 universities that charge over $50,000 for their tuition, all but one of which are private universities. That then acts as a price umbrella for the rest of the system, and the state universities spend all their time fending off these private universities, find it increasingly difficult to recruit staff because of the funding differential, are not as good at recruiting selected students, etc. Nearer to home, at the risk of being controversial, look at the difference between our state schools and our public schools and the way in which the public schools are able to get so many students into Oxford and Cambridge. Now, I know it's a complicated issue, but I think there is a parallel there about what happens if you have an elite system, and cutting off state funding does not cut them off from the state. Even apart from research funding, they are still part of the state. And in the past, to be fair to them, Oxford and Cambridge have never wanted to be separate from the state. They've always tried quite hard to retain their links with the state, and that was the deal with Cable that Cable mentioned. So I don't think it's possible. The only secure way of having a really good system is to do what the Scandinavians do, which is simply to devote more public expenditure to higher education. There's no other route, and anyone who pretends anything else is just a fool or duplicitous.
In relation to all the changes, I'd be quite interested to hear from you what you think the landscape will be in HE in a decade's time.
Well, prophesying is a fool's game. All I'm really saying is that I think there will be a substantial rationalisation of the sector. Again, if you look at chapter 3 of the book, back in the 80s, there were separate colleges of education, separate medical schools in London particularly, separate art and design institutions. Now, in the 80s, the colleges of education disappeared as colleges of education. Some of them, such as Hope, made a successful transition to being a higher education college and then university. In the 90s, the medical schools all became part of London institutions. In the 2000s, most of the separate art and design institutions have disappeared. Now, it's true that other institutions have come into the sector, but nevertheless there has been that rationalisation, so there are going to be fewer and fewer specialist institutions already. I think that for the sort of economic reasons I've indicated, if nothing else changes, there will be a further process of rationalisation, particularly in places like London, where there are simply so many institutions close together. Beyond that, I wouldn't like to predict the future. I think we will end up with larger institutions more on the American model, where a university has, a number of campuses in different parts of the city, that kind of thing. I can't see any other way that the sector will develop. Personally, what I would like to see is a more sensible kind of rationalisation. I've been quite impressed by what I've seen in the American state systems, where there is a local division of labour between institutions. So one institution, for example, is the research, has most of the research and so on, but I don't think that's going to happen really in this country. I think it'll be more a sort of pragmatic process of rationalisation, but I cannot see how some institutions are going to survive. I better not name any names, but there are some places that are not making much money now, even while they've had the benefit of the additional revenue from variable fees in 2006. Institutions which have repeated problems in recruiting students and eventually in recruiting staff, I can't see how they're going to be there in 5 or 10 years' time. But as I say, I'm not a prophet. I've got things wrong before. I just think there's a certain clear kind of direction of travel. If you look at my book over what's happened over the last 20, 30 years or so, which is a process that I think is going to continue and possibly even be slightly speeded up by these coalition government reforms.
I don't know whether mine's more of a comment more than a question, but I'll throw it there. I'm a recent graduate from last year. When we were studying, we were paying £3,500 a year for our degree. There were still funding cuts being made in certain departments, certain facilities, and I think we were the first of the students to be paying that fee, and we were already voicing our concerns and having more of an active role. The fees have increased this year to nearly £9,500 to £10,000. Where do you think the student and the university stands in that relationship? Because the more the fees increase, the more involvement the students will want to have in the curriculum and the way it's run and so on.
Yeah, that's true, but two caveats. First of all, the actual amount of money the university itself receives won't have increased, because although it may have more revenue from fees, it isn't getting funding council grants any longer, and it's having to devote quite a bit of money to things like outreach and other things. So the universities, this is one of the great paradoxes, the universities are actually not much better off as a result of the increased fee. Secondly, if you do take out a loan, I'm sorry to say it won't make me popular, it's still quite a good deal, actually. If anything, and again, I'm quite happy to be quoted on this, our student support arrangements, if you take tuition fees and living costs together, are still relatively generous in international terms. If I was advising ministers and wanting to cut down the costs of the current regime, the first thing I'd look at is the student support regime. I'm now happy to duck while people throw eggs, but that is the reality of it. So, but you're absolutely right in your thrust of your question. Yes, of course, if students are contributing £9,000 out of their own pocket, even if it's only indirectly through the repayment of the debt, of course they will be a bit more engaged. And by the way, let nothing I've said indicate that I'm against students being engaged. I noticed in my own students, I was a vice chancellor just as variable fees came in 2006. I think there is an argument about students showing more commitment to their studies if they're contributing more directly, and persisting more effectively in things of that kind. So I'm not against that in principle, but I think there are certain kind of limits, which have to be followed. And what I would not like to get into is a situation in some American, Australian universities where effectively students negotiate their grades with their lecturers. That's not the trend I would like to see here. That's all right.
I was just wondering if this relatively new phenomenon in the US of, I think it's mass online higher education, is a serious proposition going forward, or is it something that's sort of flash in the pan or disappear, where basically you log on and don't pay a thing for your lectures, as far as I understand that?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a big subject, and we're getting towards the end. I mean, on the one hand, I would say that every decade, I go back in higher education to the 80s, there's been some major development which has made people think that suddenly online learning is here, and exactly as you say, mass open online education is the thing. And so far it's never really kind of taken off in the way that's been proposed. I'm not a great fan, I have to say, because I'm old-fashioned enough to think that the essence of higher education is still the direct, I was going to say physical, but that's not quite what I mean, but the direct interaction anyway of teacher and student, really, and the opportunity that people have to work and learn together. And I simply cannot see how you can do that, you know, in the way that these online offerings propose. Also, I'm very worried, putting on briefly my quality hat, I'm very briefly about how you assure the quality of programs of that kind. How do you deal with things like plagiarism, for example? So I'm a bit sceptical. Where I think they will have real value, or could have real value, is in many developing countries which simply cannot afford to develop a higher education system because of many other claims on their resources, and possibly in these large countries where, like such as America, Canada, Australia, where access to a local university is simply physically problematic, as it were. I think they might have a role there, but I don't see them ever supplanting the traditional kind of residential model of higher education. But they, given that they are associated with prestigious institutions, yes, they have to be taken seriously.
Thank you very much. My question might sound as though I'm not entirely sympathetic with your view, but I am. But I just wanted a point of clarification on one particular aspect of your presentation, which was the ways in which markets require quality of information about the products they're presenting in order for informed consumer choice. And I suppose it was just a query about whether it's correct to establish general capitalist economies as operating with a pure notion of information, or at least whether, my point is that all forms of market have partial information supported by an awful lot of regulation, branding, marketing, wasted money, arguably, in those elements. So whether we're talking about buying a new car, a television, where these objects can be branded by any particular brand, and in fact the manufacture of some of these objects is done by a third party, nothing to do with the actual identity of the brand in a lot of cases. So I'm interested in the relationship really between branding and the actual substance of the thing itself, and whether it's right to say, or right to hold up a kind of pure knowledge model as the perfect model for how markets would operate, and therefore why that model cannot operate in higher education.
Yeah, no, I think that's a perfectly fair point, and what you're quite rightly drawing attention to is the difference in practice between markets as they operate and the pure market theory of economics, which I spent much of my time telling ministers in the DTI about with varying degrees of success. I think you can distinguish between search goods, experience goods, and post-experience goods. Search goods are ones where you want to buy a washing machine. You go onto the which website, you read which, you can identify pretty clearly which are the best brands, and so on and so on. An experience good is like a restaurant meal or a performance of an opera, you can't really tell the quality until you've experienced, until you've consumed it. And a higher education on that view is a post-experience good. You can't really tell until well afterwards probably what the value has been, and you know perfectly well. I certainly recall that subjects at university that I thought were a complete waste of time suddenly turn out to be of quite considerable value, like statistics, and others that we spent a lot of time on at the time, I did not mention it, turn out to be, not very good. So there are those kind of differences, as it were. But I mean, I'm doing it partly as a corrective, because if you simply look at what the government says and the amount of effort the universities are now putting into things like branding and marketing, then it's very, very worrying, because let us never forget, these are resources that could have been used to educate students or conduct research, which I, again, am old-fashioned enough to think that's what universities really, really should be about.
Just one more question. Morgan, you get the other question.
Do you think, Roger, that really what we've got here is an expression of a crisis to the level of democracy rather than a problem that's unique to universities?
You might think so, but I couldn't possibly comment.
My question has to do with the conclusion. I was going to say really interesting summary of points, but I think having heard Roger and then heard the question, I mean, I think that's enough in a sense to kind of represent the whole issue and to make people realise how important this issue is. So it's great that Roger's here to talk about it. It's even better that he's actually committed himself and make it down. Because very often with this kind of arguments, some of the arguments are very subtle, and Roger's already pointed out. You need time to reflect on it, having a book here, with liking the book, take that message further. So when Roger first started to talk, I thought, I'm getting more and more impressed with him. It seems like the end game is here. And I thought, where is the alternative? Are we on a course which is totally inevitable? And he's mentioned places like Sweden and also America, interestingly, that there is an alternative. And I suppose the point is that if you value the things that Roger spoke about in a university, in his notions of a university, then it's up to you all to orchestrate or to try and shape the vision so that we don't go to what appears to be the inevitable end game. So this is a profoundly important issue. And as Morgan said again, as you actually asked the question, Morgan, that I was formulating in my own mind, is this about politics or is this about societal causes? Indeed, this is a global thing. And, where do we stand? It's important to take a stand on this issue, regardless of which side you stand on. Okay, so Roger, that was really interesting. As he said, he'll be out there, as all the web workers do, to sign a copy of his book. And I think we've actually got refreshments in the just around the corner on the left-hand side of the chair. So thank you, Roger.
Thank you. Thank you very much.